My name is Erica, and I'm 39 years old. My husband Mark is 6 years my senior, and we've been married for over 15 years. This year, our daughter started high school, which marks a new chapter in our lives. After settling down to raise our child, I started a handmade business. It's been thriving, and I'm increasingly busy with orders. While things seem to be going well professionally, my married life has been a different story. Mark and I met at work, where he was my trainer. His maturity and the 6-year age difference initially attracted me. We started dating, and not long after, I discovered I was pregnant. The unexpected news led us to marry quickly. Due to severe morning sickness and Mark's request, I resigned from my job and became a housewife. As soon as I left work, I was expected to handle chores at my mother-in-law's house, which was just a 5-minute walk from ours. Despite my struggles with morning sickness, I was pressured to help out, as my mother-in-law insisted it was my duty as a wife. My husband and mother-in-law frequently reminded me that, as a wife, I was obligated to handle household tasks and follow my mother-in-law's directives. This constant pressure made me start believing that I had no choice but to comply. Living with a growing child and having quit my job made it hard for me to rely on my own parents for support. Divorce was never a consideration at the time. Fortunately, Mark was kind to our daughter, Nancy, and I managed to endure the situation. However, things changed when Mark's brother married and had a baby boy. My mother-in-law's attitude shifted, and she became critical of Nancy, often lamenting about the lack of a male heir. Mark, worried about his mother's views, began to distance himself from Nancy, who he had once cherished deeply. Mark's family is not involved in business and lives off their vegetable garden and a large backyard. They had land generations ago but gave it up long ago. I couldn't understand why there was such a fixation on heirs, especially with outdated notions about the eldest son and heir. To protect Nancy from hearing these hurtful words, I tried to limit our visits to Mark's parents. During my pregnancy, they called frequently, but after Nancy was born, I often refused their visits. I wanted to focus on my daughter and distance myself from my in-laws' selfish expectations. When I finally reached the end of my patience, I made a decisive change. As soon as my daughter turned 2, I returned to work, despite my husband and mother-in-law's displeasure. Anticipating their resistance, I kept my decision to myself until I had secured a job and enrolled my daughter in daycare. During this time, a friend suggested I try making handmade goods, and what started as a hobby quickly evolved into a passion. I began creating and selling my work, and it gained momentum after a friend admired a piece and wanted to purchase it. Her praise encouraged me, and soon her friends followed suit, spreading the word about my creations. As demand increased, I decided to sell my items online. The orders kept pouring in, and what began as a side job soon became my full-time career as a professional artist. Despite my success, I continued to distance myself from my in-laws. Visits during holidays like Thanksgiving and Christmas were inevitable, though. As my daughter grew older, my mother-in-law began to impose household chores on her, insisting, "She's a girl. It's expected." It was infuriating, but my daughter's calm demeanor helped me keep my composure. Although these visits were infrequent, they were painful to endure. I felt heartbroken watching my daughter quietly do her chores, feeling pity and sadness as I witnessed her comply with my mother-in-law's demands. Meanwhile, my husband enjoyed his time socializing with relatives and siblings, seemingly unaffected by the discomfort I felt. I felt even more miserable as I walked into the house. "Hi there, you must be hungry. I'll make dinner soon," I greeted my daughter when she came home from school. But she seemed different. Her usual cheerfulness was replaced with a sullen expression. She called out to me, but her eyes were distant and troubled. Concerned, I rushed over. "What's wrong? Did something happen at school?" I asked, but she only shook her head silently. My daughter had always been calm, never shedding a tear since starting middle school. I waited patiently, hoping she would open up. Finally, she spoke, her voice trembling. "Dad? What about him?" I prompted, sensing something was deeply troubling her. Her eyes filled with tears. "He was hugging a woman," she said, a tear escaping down her cheek. More followed, and soon her face was streaked with tears. Over time, my husband and I had grown distant, though we remained united for our daughter's sake. Despite our strained relationship, I had hoped he would stay faithful, and I accepted his lack of involvement in housework and childcare. I never blamed him for that. I was determined to avoid raising our daughter in a single-parent household, so I convinced myself that our situation was tolerable. We might not smile together, but as a family of three, we could still find moments of laughter. Now, though, my husband's betrayal was clear. My daughter's tears were a painful reminder of the love and trust that had been eroded, and I felt a deep sadness in seeing her cry about something so heart-wrenching. I felt my eyes burn with anger as I looked at my daughter. "Mom, I'm sorry," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Why are you apologizing, Nancy?" I asked, though I could see the pain in her eyes. She remained silent, her gaze fixed on the floor. Seeing her distress only deepened my own. I felt like I was failing her as a mother. "I'm sorry, Nancy. I'm just such a weak mother. If I hadn't seen it." "No, Nancy, you didn't do anything wrong," I reassured her, though my heart was heavy. Her uniform was damp with tears, and her face was trembling as she clenched her fists. My own tears, which I had tried so hard to hold back, began to fall. "I can't forgive him," I said softly, my resolve strengthening. "Honey, can we talk for a minute?" I asked my husband when he came home. "I'm tired," he replied curtly, barely glancing at me. His cold tone would usually have silenced me, but today was different. "I have something important to tell you," I said, struggling to stay calm. He clicked his tongue in annoyance and sat down across from me at the dining table. "What's it about? What have you been up to today?" "Of course, I was working," I answered, though his dismissive attitude only fueled my frustration. Without warning, he slammed his hand on the table, yelling, "What are you asking me?" I took a deep breath and continued, "I saw you hugging a woman." I didn't mention that Nancy had seen it too. My husband's reaction was immediate and harsh. "So what?" he snapped, looking at me with a scowl. "What about it?" "Are you cheating on me?" I asked, my voice trembling. He laughed derisively. "What else could it be?" His mockery left me speechless, my mind reeling from his offensive demeanor. As he noticed my reaction, he looked at me with an expression that mixed disdain and curiosity. "What's wrong with that?" he asked, his tone dripping with contempt. "What do you have to complain about?" "It's an affair," I said, struggling to keep my voice steady. "You don't even care about our relationship." His response was chilling, as if it were all just a matter of fact. "We got married because you were pregnant. We stayed together out of obligation. What more do you want from me?" His words cut deep. "I've been here all this time, supporting you," he continued, his laughter bitter and victorious. When he noticed the divorce papers I had prepared, he grabbed them from me. "Divorce papers? What's this? You thought showing me these would make me listen? Nonsense. If you want it so badly, I'll sign them for you," he said with a sneer. He filled out the papers with exaggerated motions and threw them at me. "How can you even think of divorcing me? I've been taking care of you while you're not even working. You quit your job just because you had a baby. You're nothing." His harsh words echoed in my mind as I looked at the divorce papers on the floor. "You should be grateful I'm not the one asking for the divorce," he continued. "If you don't want it, don't say anything." With that, he took out his phone and began dialing. His sweet, false voice made it clear he was calling his girlfriend. I knew I couldn't confront him about it, so I stayed silent. About a month later, it was time for our annual Christmas visit to my in-laws. My husband was eager to go, bustling around to get ready. "Hey," I said, trying to catch his attention. "I need to talk to you." "Not now. We're running late," he replied dismissively. "You can talk to me at my parents' house." He hurriedly bundled me and our daughter into the car, his excitement palpable. As usual, he was the only one chatting cheerfully, while I felt the weight of our unresolved issues and his lack of respect. "Welcome home," he said as we arrived, but his words felt hollow and meaningless to me. When we arrived, my mother-in-law greeted us with a forced smile and ushered us into the living room. We exchanged pleasantries with the relatives who had arrived before us. "Oh my God, it's so nice to see you after such a long time," my mother-in-law said with exaggerated cheerfulness. Her emphasis on long time hinted at her displeasure over my recent absence. I knew she resented that I hadn't been visiting as often. "As my daughter-in-law, you need to help with the chores," she always said whenever I came over, though she never asked the same of my brother-in-law's wife. But then again, they lived far away and rarely visited. My mother-in-law directed me to the kitchen. I didn't mind helping at first, but when she also urged my daughter, Nancy, to join, I felt a pang of frustration. "No, I began, but my mother-in-law cut me off. "She's a girl, she should be able to do this," she said, her tone dismissive. At that moment, something inside me snapped. I turned to my husband, who was preparing drinks. "Honey, we need to talk." "What is it now?" he responded, irritation evident on his face. This can't wait. It has to be now, I insisted, ignoring his annoyed expression. Erica, let's handle this later, he said, clearly wanting to avoid the confrontation. Let's focus on the party for now. But my mother-in-law interrupted again, concerned about how her relatives would perceive her. You're my daughter-in-law. I have plenty of work for you, she said, trying to divert attention from the issue at hand. After scanning the room and seeing the curious glances of her guests, she muttered, on Christmas Day, I'll make sure she and her daughter handle everything. Taking a deep breath, I stood up, holding my daughter's hand firmly. I'm done with this. I'm getting a divorce. What? What are you talking about? My husband and mother-in-law gasped in shock, their faces a mix of confusion and disbelief. I tried to ignore the chaos and focus on leaving with my daughter, but they blocked our way. What do you mean by divorce? My mother-in-law demanded, her voice rising in disbelief. She glared at both me and my husband, who was clearly caught off guard. It was evident he hadn't been expecting this revelation. I mean exactly what I said. I'm divorcing this man, I replied firmly. What? I didn't hear anything about this, my husband stammered. What's going on? You told me to go ahead and file the papers if I wanted a divorce. Well, I've done just that, I said, my tone unwavering. My husband was left speechless, clearly unable to process the situation. His optimism had clearly blinded him to the reality of our marriage. You weren't serious about this, were you? He finally managed to ask. Of course I was serious, I replied. Thank you for the papers. I've already submitted them. And as for why I'm telling you here, look around. This is exactly why. You've avoided any real conversation about this, and now we're facing it. My husband's face turned red as he realized the full extent of the public humiliation he was enduring. He had avoided discussing our issues, and now the consequences were unavoidable. But my mother-in-law wasn't done. What's this about? I can't believe you're divorcing my son. You must have done something wrong, Erica. I looked at her incredulous. How can you be so sure I'm at fault? Your son is trembling, and you still think it's all my fault? My husband was clearly at a loss for words, flustered by the unexpected revelations. My mother-in-law, still in shock, demanded, how am I going to explain this to others? I turned to Nancy, who had been watching the scene unfold. Nancy, why don't you tell them what you saw? Nancy's cold gaze cut through the tension as she spoke. Even though Dad is cheating on Mom. What? My mother-in-law froze, unable to process the new information. My husband, stunned, could only look at Nancy in disbelief. Why? Nancy asked, her voice trembling. I saw you hugging another woman. What? My husband stammered, clearly caught off guard. It's okay, Nancy, I said gently, though I could see the disgust in her eyes. She no longer wanted anything to do with her father, and it broke my heart a little. I wondered if I should have kept her from coming today, even though she'd insisted on it. Are we done here? I asked, ready to leave. This is false accusation, my husband suddenly blurted. You have no proof. I'm not divorcing you. His defiance caught me off guard. How can you say that? You've always claimed you never loved me. Is this about maintaining appearances? You don't have any proof, he shouted, stuttering as he tried to defend himself. I calmly reached into my bag and pulled out several photos, scattering them across the floor. Here's your proof, I said. The photos showed him walking hand in hand with a young woman. The evidence was undeniable, and he could no longer deny his actions in front of his extended family. His face turned red as he scrambled to gather the pictures. Why did you? He began, but his voice trailed off. I think you've gone too far, I replied. I never condoned cheating. I had hired a private detective to investigate my husband's behavior. The detective not only followed him but also recorded his conversations with the woman who had spoken freely about my husband's behavior and even made derogatory remarks about me. How did you know that? My husband asked, his face paling. The relatives surrounding us looked on in shock, and my mother-in-law's face was one of disbelief. Mary, I'm not your son anymore. My husband said. Even if I was married to your son, I had no obligation to take care of this house, I said firmly. I'm done. From now on, please contact my lawyer. With that, Nancy and I left. I had already filed for divorce and was pursuing alimony. Although my ex-husband initially resisted, the hard evidence I presented made him concede. I also filed a claim against the woman he was involved with, and she agreed to compensate me. The scandal spread among their relatives and neighbors, causing them considerable embarrassment. My daughter and I embarked on a new chapter, free from the ties that once bound us. As a handmade artist, my business thrived with an influx of online orders. My daughter informed me that our story had even made its way onto social media. I'm finally free from the constraints of my past. Despite the hardships, I now have the opportunity to do what I want, take care of my daughter, and fully enjoy my life.